The morning air smelled of wet earth and sweat. The auction yard was already alive, crowded with men who had come to buy land, tools, and human beings. A wooden platform stood at the center like a stage, and the auctioneer's voice cut through the noise, sharp, practiced, merciless. Here, lives were not counted, they were measured, valued, priced. She stood among the others, slightly apart, her head lowered, her hands clasped tightly together as if letting go would cause her to fall apart. She was not yet fully a woman, but no longer a child either. 16, perhaps 17. No one bothered to ask. Age here was guessed by teeth, shoulders, hips, by usefulness. Her name still lived somewhere inside her, whispered in a corner of her memory. But in this place, names did not matter. Only strength did. Only obedience. Only what her body could give. Her beauty was impossible to ignore, and she hated it for that. It was not the pale, delicate beauty the men praised in their wives, but something warmer, quieter, sun-kissed skin, soft curves, eyes too deep for someone so young. She had tangled her hair on purpose, knowing neatness increased value. Even fear had taught her strategy. She knew what they looked for: strong arms, a healthy back, a body capable of bearing children. Every breath she took felt like it was being evaluated. When the auctioneer called her forward, her body froze. Her feet felt buried in the dirt, as if the ground itself was begging her to stay. A firm hand pressed lightly against her shoulder from behind, not violent, just commanding. That single touch said everything. Move. She stepped forward. With each step, something inside her slipped further away. The crowd leaned in. Eyes crawled over her skin. Some curious, some greedy, some smiling in ways that made her stomach tighten. She was told to turn. She turned. Her back was straight, her face calm, but inside her chest, her heart slammed against her ribs, begging to escape. Open your mouth. She obeyed. Turn again. She did. Hands touched her arms, her waist, her shoulders. Fingers pressed into muscle, into flesh, testing her like livestock. Every touch carved something invisible into her soul. The auctioneer spoke loudly, confidently, as if advertising a tool. Young, strong, healthy, good breeding stock. Good breeding stock. She swallowed hard, her throat burning. Then she saw him. He was not shouting like the others, not waving money or laughing loudly. He stood slightly apart, dressed neatly, his posture calm, his face unreadable. His eyes were sharp, steady, watching her not with excitement but with certainty. When his gaze met hers, her breath caught. It was not desire she saw there, it was ownership, as if the decision had already been made before she stepped onto the platform. The bidding began. Numbers rose. Some men dropped out quickly, shaking their heads. Too expensive, perhaps, or maybe there was something about her eyes, something too aware, too alive, that unsettled them. She hoped, foolishly, that no one would want her, that she would be overlooked. But the quiet man remained. When the auctioneer asked for more bids, the man raised his hand once. No words, no hesitation. That single motion ended everything. Sold. The word echoed inside her head long after the crowd began to disperse. Her knees steadied, not from strength, but from shock. People moved on to the next body, the next life. The noise returned, but for her, the world had gone strangely silent. She was led away, a rope placed loosely in her hand. Not tight enough to hurt, not loose enough to forget it was there. A reminder. Escape was pointless. She did not ask where she was going. Questions had never saved anyone here. She stared out as the cart moved, watching fields stretch endlessly under the open sky. Freedom surrounded her, mocking her. Everything was wide, open, and utterly unreachable. The plantation appeared in the distance like a promise she never wanted. Large, orderly, quiet. She was taken inside, washed, dressed in clean clothes softer than anything she had worn before. That frightened her more than chains would have. Kindness, when given without choice, always came at a price. Night fell slowly. Lamps were lit. She stood alone in a small room, the air heavy with unfamiliar silence. Then the door opened. He stood there again, closer this time. He said nothing. He did not need to. His eyes moved over her calmly, as if confirming a purchase. She lowered her gaze, her entire body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But he only watched her for a moment longer before turning away, the door closing softly behind him. That silence was worse than shouting. She lay awake that night, staring into the dark. Memories crept in, the faint image of her mother's face, already blurred by time, the sound of laughter from a childhood that felt borrowed, unfinished. She pressed her hand against her chest, as if she could protect whatever was left of herself. She did not yet know what this purchase truly meant. She did not know how many lives would begin inside her because of it. She did not know how much she would lose before she turned 30. All she knew was this: in that auction yard she had not only been sold, her future had been sealed. The first child came quietly, almost secretly, as if even life itself was afraid to announce its arrival. By the time she realized the change in her body could no longer be hidden, the plantation already knew. They always knew. The whispers began long before anyone spoke to her directly. Eyes followed her when she walked. The older women in the quarters looked at her with a mixture of pity and understanding. No questions, no comfort, only knowing glances. This was not rare. It was expected. Still, nothing could have prepared her for how alone she felt, carrying a life that was never meant to be acknowledged. She was not allowed to speak of it. No one said the master's name out loud in connection with her swelling belly, but the truth lived in every silence. She was moved from the fields to lighter work, not out of mercy but preservation. What she carried was valuable, not as a child, as proof, as property multiplied. Her body was no longer hers in any sense. It had become a vessel, carefully watched, carefully controlled. When the pain finally came, it came at night. No doctor was called, no prayers were whispered over her. She was taken to a narrow room behind the main house, where the walls were bare and the window was too small to offer comfort. An older enslaved woman helped her through it, gripping her hand so tightly her fingers went numb. She bit down on a cloth to keep from screaming. Pain was allowed, noise was not. The baby cried before she did. It was a boy, pale enough that no one could pretend otherwise. His hair was softer, lighter than hers. His skin carried the unmistakable mark of his father's blood. She held him for only a moment before he was taken away. Not far, never far, but far enough to remind her that love, like everything else, came with limits. She was allowed to nurse him. That was her privilege. That was her purpose. During the day, he stayed with a woman whose only task was to keep him clean, quiet, invisible. At night he was Brew. Tat to her. She memorized his face in those short hours, the way his tiny fingers curled around hers, the sound of his breathing when he slept against her chest. She loved him fiercely, silently, desperately. Loving him openly would have been dangerous. He lived in the shadows of the house, too white for the quarters, too enslaved for the family. He belonged nowhere, and she knew, with a dread that settled deep in her bones, that the world would never forgive him for that. The master never spoke of the child. He did not need to. Sometimes she felt his presence in the room when the baby was near, a pause in the hallway, a door left slightly open. Other times she sensed his absence just as strongly. The child was his and yet never his, a secret allowed to breathe but not to exist. Another pregnancy followed sooner than she had time to recover. Her body learned pain as a rhythm. The second child was a girl, darker than her brother but still marked, still undeniable. This time, the silence felt heavier. The rules became stricter. She was warned, gently, coldly, not to grow attached, as if that were possible. She tried to protect them in the only way she could. She sang softly when no one was listening. She kissed their foreheads when the lamps were low. She taught herself to smile less, to draw no attention. Every breath she took was an act of calculation. Safety was a fragile thing. The children grew slowly, cautiously, like plants denied sunlight. They were kept clean, well-fed, but never embraced by the house. They learned early not to cry loudly. They learned not to ask questions. She watched them absorb the rules of survival before they could fully speak. Sometimes, when the master's wife passed them in the corridor, there was a flicker of recognition, anger restrained into dignity. The children were not blamed directly, but neither were they forgiven. Their excess, tense, was a living insult, a mirror held up to truths no one wanted to face. By the time the third child was born, her youth had already begun to fade. Her body bore the marks of repeated childbirth, stretching, exhaustion, pain that never fully left. This one lived only a few days. Fever took him before she could memorize his face. She held him as his breathing slowed, her tears falling silently onto his skin. There was no funeral, no marker, just a small, hurried burial behind the far edge of the property where grief was buried along with the body. She returned to work the next morning. After that, fear became constant. Every cough made her heart race. Every fever felt like a death sentence waiting to be carried out. She slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, counting breaths in the dark. Her love for her children was tangled with terror. Loving them meant imagining losing them, and she lost them slowly, one by one. The fourth child survived longer, long enough to speak, long enough to ask why he could not play with the other children, long enough to understand he was different. His questions cut deeper than any punishment ever had. She had no answers that could protect him. Illness came again. This time it was slow, lingering. He weakened day by day, his small body no match for a world that never wanted him. She begged quietly for help, not aloud, never allowed, but with looks, with obedience sharpened into desperation. Help came too late, or not at all. He died in her arms just before dawn. She did not scream. She could not afford to. By the fifth pregnancy, she had stopped counting weeks. She had stopped hoping. She moved through each day like a ghost, her eyes hollowed by anticipation of loss. This child was born still. She did not cry when she saw him. Something inside her had gone quiet. The plantation continued as if nothing had happened. Crops air harvested. Meals were served. Life went on, uninterrupted. Her grief existed only inside her, unnamed and unshared. She learned to bury her sorrow where no one could see it, the same way she buried her children. Yet at night, when the house slept, she sat alone and remembered every face, every breath, every heartbeat that had once lived inside her. Her children had been born into shadows, denied names, denied futures, denied even proper graves. They had existed only briefly, but they had been real, and she carried them with her, etched into her bones. She was still young, but her soul felt ancient. Motherhood had not been a blessing. It had been a sentence. And with every child born in silence, she understood more clearly that love in this world was not meant to survive. Still, she loved them. She always would. Death did not arrive all at once. It learned her routine first. It watched her learn the weight of each morning, the careful way she lifted herself from sleep, the way her eyes searched for small movements, breath, fingers, the quiet proof that someone she loved was still alive. Then it began to take, slowly, methodically, as if it had all the time in the world. The first grave had taught her shock. The second taught her fear. By the third, grief became something else entirely, an occupation of the body, a permanent ache that settled into muscle and bone. She no longer cried the way she once had. Tears drew attention. Attention invited questions. Questions were dangerous. So she learned to mourn in fragments, in the pauses between tasks, in the brief seconds when she was alone with her thoughts and the sound of her own breathing. She buried her children without markers, no names carved into stone, no dates to remember them by, just patches of disturbed earth that looked like any other once the soil settled. She memorized the locations anyway. The crook, Ed tree, the place where the ground dipped slightly, the edge of the field where the grass never grew quite right. These were her maps. Her memory became their only monument. Illness moved through the plantation like a rumor. Sometimes it was a cough that would not leave, sometimes fever, sometimes a sickness that no one bothered to name because naming it would not save anyone. The enslaved children were always the first to weaken. Smaller bodies, fewer protections. When the master's children fell ill, doctors were summoned. When hers did, she was told to keep them quiet. She did everything she could with nothing. Cool cloths, whispered songs, water measured carefully, as if too much might steal the little strength they had left. She counted breaths at night, her ear pressed to their chests, terrified of the moment she would hear nothing at all. Sleep became a gamble she rarely took. One child lingered for weeks, suspended between living and leaving. He was old enough to understand pain, old enough to fear it. He asked her if he was going to die. She lied. She had learned how. She told him he would be fine, that he just needed rest, that she was there. She did not tell him that the world had already decided he did not belong in it. When he finally slipped away, it was so quiet she almost missed it. One moment, breath. The next, stillness. Her body reacted before her mind did. She shook him gently at first, then harder, whispering his name over and over until the sound broke into something raw and animal. Then she remembered where she was. She swallowed the noise. She held him close, rocking back and forth, as if motion alone could bring him back. She buried him before sunrise. Each burial made the next one easier to perform and harder to survive. Her hands learned the work of digging. Her back learned the weight of small bodies wrapped in cloth. Her heart learned, too, to close doors she never knew existed. She stopped imagining futures for her children. Imagination only made the losses sharper. The master never attended the burials. He never asked how many she had lost. Numbers, like names, were unnecessary. The plantation ledger recorded births the way it recorded livestock. Assets gained, assets lost. Her children were never written down. They passed through the world without leaving ink behind. The wife of the house pretended not to see her grief. When they passed each other, there was an understanding. Silent, rigid, bitter. This was not sympathy. It was endurance. Two women surviving the same system from opposite sides of it, both constrained, both complicit in different ways. Neither spoke. As the years passed, death became a pattern. A child would weaken. She would notice the signs before anyone else. The way their skin dulled, the way their appetite faded, the way their eyes lost focus. She would brace herself, even as she fought it. Hope and dread lived side by side, inseparable. One winter was especially cruel. Cold seeped into the quarters and never left. Children coughed through the night. She wrapped her youngest in every scrap of cloth she could find, pressing him against her chest for warmth. She did not sleep for days. When exhaustion finally dragged her under, she woke to a silence that felt wrong. He was already gone. That one broke something in her that never healed. She carried his body through the cold morning, numb, her feet moving on instinct. The ground was hard, frozen. It took longer than usual. Her hands bled. She did not feel it. By then, people had stopped offering even quiet glances of pity. Loss had become expected. She was known for it, the woman whose children never lived, as if fate itself had marked her. But she remembered them all, the weight of each one, the sound of their breathing, the way their heads fit beneath her chin. She carried those details like contraband, hidden but precious. Time blurred. Seasons passed without meaning. Birth, illness, burial, repeat. Her body aged faster than the calendar allowed. Lines appeared at the corners of her eyes. Her movements slowed. She was still young by numbers, but the mirror told a different story. Grief had rewritten her face. Sometimes she wondered if loving them had been a mistake, if detachment might have spared her something. But then she remembered the feel of their hands in hers, the way they searched for her in the dark, the way they relaxed when they knew she was there. Love had not saved them, but it had made them human in a world determined to erase them. There were moments, rare, dangerous moments, when anger rose higher than grief. Anger at the system that created children only to discard them. Anger at the man whose blood marked them and abandoned them. Anger at herself for surviving when they had not. That anger frightened her more than sorrow. Anger could get her killed, so she buried that too. By the time the last grave was filled, she had lost count of how many times she had knelt in the dirt. Her knees ached, her hands were scarred, her heart felt hollowed out like a house emptied room by room. She stood there for a long time after the soil was smoothed, staring at nothing, waiting to feel something, anything. Nothing came. She returned to work. She always did. The plantation demanded continuity. Crops did not pause for mourning. Meals were still served, floors still scrubbed. Life insisted on moving forward, dragging her with it. At night, when she lay alone, the silence was unbearable. She heard them in her dreams, soft cries, half-formed words, the sound of laughter that never lasted long enough. She woke with her arms wrapped around empty air. She was not yet 30, and she had buried them all. The world had taken everything it wanted from her and then asked her to keep living. Grief was not something she was allowed to show. It was not forbidden by law, but by consequence. Tears invited attention, and attention invited questions, and questions led to punishments she could not afford. So she learned to make her face still. She learned how to swallow pain before it reached her eyes. On the plantation, survival depended not just on strength, but on invisibility. The morning after a burial looked the same as every other morning. The bell rang. The house stirred. Work began. She washed her face with cold water until the redness faded, until no trace of the night remained. Her hands moved automatically, scrubbing floors, carrying trays, folding linens that smelled of soap and comfort she would never touch. Inside her chest, something screamed constantly, but she kept it locked behind her ribs. No one asked how she was. No one ever had. Her losses were not considered losses at all, just interruptions in productivity. She had learned early that mourning was a privilege reserved for certain kinds of mothers. Mothers whose children had names, futures, and a place in the world. She had been a mother in secret, and so her grief also had to live in secret. Sometimes she caught herself reaching for a child who was no longer there, a habit of the body refusing to accept absence. Her arms would tense, her breath hitch, and then she would remember. Always that moment of remembering, sharp, humiliating, private. She would lower her hands quickly, as if hoping no one had noticed the reflex of love. The house was the hardest place to exist. It was filled with reminders. Children's laughter echoed down hallways, carefree and loud. Toys were left scattered on polished floors. The mistress's children grew taller, stronger, watched over by doctors and tutor. RS and careful hands. She served them meals, adjusted their clothes, cleaned their rooms. She smiled when spoken to. She obeyed. All the while she carried the memory of children who had never been allowed to grow. Once she heard one of them cry in the night, and her body reacted before her mind could stop it. She took a step toward the sound, heart racing, hands already lifting. Then she froze. That cry was not meant for her. It never was. She turned away slowly, ashamed of her own instinct. The mistress knew. Of course she knew. Women always knew. There was no conversation, no confrontation, just a constant tension that lived in the air between them. When their paths crossed, there was stiffness, restraint, a careful refusal to acknowledge the shared truth. The mistress's eyes sometimes lingered on her face, searching for something, regret, guilt, triumph. She offered none of it. She had nothing left to give. There were days when the weight of unexpressed grief made her chest ache, when breathing felt like pushing against stone. On those days she worked harder. Physical exhaustion was easier to manage than emotional collapse. She welcomed sore muscles and aching joints because they distracted her from the deeper pain that had no remedy. At night she mourned in pieces. A few tears wiped away quickly, a whisper of a name into the darkness. A memory replayed until it hurt too much, and she forced herself to stop. She learned how to interrupt her own thoughts, how to redirect her mind before it betrayed her. Survival demanded discipline. The older women noticed the change in her. They said nothing, but they saw it. The way her eyes had dulled, the way her movements had slowed, the way her laughter had vanished entirely. Once, an older woman pressed something small into her hand in passing, a scrap of cloth, neatly folded. She recognized it instantly. A burial wrappy. A silent acknowledgement. She closed her fingers around it, feeling seen for the first time in years. But even that comfort was dangerous. Attachment had already cost her too much. She was still young, yet she felt ancient. Time had not passed for her the way it did for others. It had piled up, heavy and relentless. Every year added another layer of memory, another loss to carry. Her reflection startled her sometimes. Lines had formed around her eyes and mouth, not from age but from restraint, from holding herself together for too long. She wondered, occasionally, what kind of woman she might have been in another life. A life where her children were allowed to live, where grief could be spoken aloud, where love did not have to be hidden like a crime. Those thoughts were dangerous too. Longing for an impossible world only sharpened the pain of the real one. There were moments when her grief turned inward, becoming something darker. a quiet anger at herself for surviving. Why her when they were gone? Why was her body spared when theirs were not? The question haunted her in sleepless hours, pressing against her chest until guilt became another form of punishment. She carried that guilt carefully. Like everything else, the plantation demanded gratitude, gratitude for food, gratitude for shelter, gratitude for continued existence. She learned how to perform it convincingly. A lowered gaze, a soft yes, a measured obedience. Inside she felt nothing resembling gratitude, only endurance. One afternoon she was ordered to clear out a storage room in the main house. Old belongings, forgotten things. In the corner, beneath dust and neglect, she found a small wooden toy. Cracked, faded, discarded. She froze. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. It looked exactly like one her son had once held briefly before it was taken away. She stood there for a long time, unable to move, her fingers trembling inches away from it. She did not take it. She could not risk being seen with something like that. Instead, she closed the box, sealing the memory inside, and walked away. It took every ounce of control she had not to break down right there on the floor. That night, the grief returned with violence. It crashed over her in waves, relentless and unforgiving. She pressed her face into the thin mattress, biting down to keep from making a sound. Her shoulders shook, her chest burned. She mourned every child at once, the ones she had held, the ones she barely knew, the ones who never took a breath. She mourned the mother she had been forced to become, and the one she had been denied the chance to be. By morning she rose again. She always did. Her mourning had no witnesses, no rituals, no end. It was a constant companion, shaping her days, her silences, her survival. The world had not allowed her to be a mother in life, and it would not allow her to be one in grief either. So she carried it alone. And in doing so, she learned the cruelest lesson of all, that sometimes the deepest pain is not loss itself, but being denied the right to openly mourn what was taken from you. By the time she turned 30, the number meant nothing to her. It was not marked by celebration, not even by awareness. There was no candle to count the years, no voice to announce the day. Age, like everything else in her life, passed quietly. But her body knew. It carried 30 years the way others carried twice that. Every joint ached with memory. Every breath felt measured, deliberate, earned. She had buried them all by then. Not just the children whose names she whispered into the dark, but the versions of herself that had died alongside them. The young girl who once believed fear had an end. The mother who still hoped love might protect something. The woman who imagined grief would eventually soften. None of them survived. What remained was someone harder to recognize. Not broken. Broken things still show their damage. She had learned how to seal cracks so well that even she could no longer find them. Her face had settled into calm neutrality, a mask so practiced it felt natural. People mistook it for strength. It was not. It was containment. The plantation continued its routines, indifferent to her internal reckoning. Crops rose and fell with the seasons. Children were born and grew older. New enslaved girls arrived with the same wide-eyed fear she once carried. She saw herself in them and looked away. Recognition was dangerous. Sometimes she caught her reflection in water or glass and studied it as if it belonged to someone else. The softness of youth was gone. In its place was a quiet severity, a stillness shaped by survival. Her eyes held stories no one would ever ask to hear. She wondered if, without realizing it, she had become invisible, not just to others but to herself. There were moments when the past reached out unexpectedly, a laugh that sounded too familiar. A child's silhouette at dusk, a small shoe left near a doorway. Each time her chest tightened, her breath stalled, and she forced herself back into the present. She had learned not to follow memory too far. It led only to places she could not stay. She no longer dreamed of escape. That desert had burned out long ago, replaced by something quieter and heavier, endurance. She did not hope for freedom because hope required imagining a future, and the future had never been kind to her. Instead, she focused on getting through each day intact. That was her rebellion, remaining whole enough to continue. There were rumors sometimes, whispers among the enslaved about changes coming, about laws shifting, about distant possibilities. She listened without reacting. She had lived long enough to know that promises meant little when they traveled slowly and arrived late. Still, a small part of her, buried deep, registered them, not with hope, but with caution. The master aged, his hair grayed, his authority softened around the edges, though it never disappeared. She noticed these changes with a detached awareness. He had taken so much from her without ever acknowledging it. Now time was taking from him, quietly, without asking permission. The symmetry was not satisfying, it was simply there. The mistress grew colder, more distant. Her children grew into roles already prepared for them. The world kept organizing itself around inherited power and invisible labor. She remained where she had always been, necessary, unrecognized, enduring. On some nights, when exhaustion loosened her control, she allowed herself to remember everything at once. She replayed each birth, each loss, each burial. She pictured the places where the earth held what remained of her children. She imagined them older, taller, speaking voices she had never heard. She allowed herself these visions briefly, like touching a flame just long enough to feel warmth before pulling away. She wondered if they would recognize her, if such a thing were possible. If somewhere beyond suffering, beyond silence, they existed without pain. These thoughts frightened her as much as they comforted her. Faith was another. Risk, belief invited disappointment. She had outlived every expectation placed upon her. She had produced life. She had endured loss. She had continued working, breathing, existing in a world that had extracted everything it could from her and then demanded more. There was no ceremony for survival, no acknowledgement. But survival itself became her quiet testament. Sometimes younger women sought her out without quite knowing why. They stood near her, worked beside her, watched how she moved through space. She did not offer advice. Advice could not protect anyone here. What she offered instead was presence, steady, unreactive, calm. She showed them how to remain standing when everything inside wanted to collapse. In rare moments of solitude, she asked herself who she was now, without children, without hope, without even the sharp edge of grief. The answer never came easily. Perhaps identity, like everything else, had been stripped away. Or perhaps she had become something simpler and stronger, someone who had seen the worst and refused to disappear. By 30, she understood a truth that had taken years to form. The world would never return what it had taken from her. No apology would arrive, no justice would balance the loss. Waiting for that reckoning was another way to be destroyed. Letting go of it was the only way to remain. She did not forgive. Forgiveness required acknowledgement. She did not forget. Forgetting would have erased the only proof her children had ever existed. Instead, she remembered quietly, fully, and without expectation. Her life did not become easier, it became narrower. But within that narrow space, she learned how to breathe, how to observe, how to endure without surrendering the last pieces of herself. That was the victory she claimed, though no one named it as such. When she crossed the threshold of 30, nothing outward changed. The sun rose, work began, the world continued its rhythm. But inside her, something settled. The understanding that she had survived what should have erased her entirely. She had buried her children, yes, but she had not buried herself. And in a world built to consume her, that quiet persistence was the most powerful act left to her.